Welcome, everyone. My name is Phil Getz. I'm the managing editor of SAPIR. Very glad you've joined us today for the final virtual event of our current issue on the topic of faith. And we will be hosting an in-person event on Sunday, November 3rd with Rabbi David Wolpe, philosopher and author Rebecca Noberger Goldstein, about their respective articles in this issue on Jewish theism and Jewish atheism, specifically addressing the question, is belief in God crucial for living a Jewish life? Rabbi Wolpe and Dr. Goldstein will be hosted by and in conversation with Rabbi David Ingber of 2nd Street Y, 92 NY on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And the event will be in person and live streamed online. You can buy tickets on the 92 NY website or find a link in the event section of the SAPIR website as well. So I hope you can join us for that. I think that'll be a very lively discussion. But today we are joined by Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, one of the most important thinkers in the Haredi world today, I think it's fair to say. And Rabbi Pfeffer is the head of the Iyun Institute, focused on promoting Haredi integration and responsibility, the founding editor of Iyun, a journal of Haredi thought and ideas. And he is also a community rabbi in Ramot in Jerusalem. And we are discussing Rabbi Pfeffer's excellent article in the current issue of SAPIR. Before we begin, I just want to give a little bit of an outline. I suppose we are planning to speak for about 40 minutes. And then we will take Q&A. So please feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A function in the Zoom, and we'll get to those after we go through our 40-minute discussion. So I want to begin by saying that, the article is in this issue is called Haredi Faith, Theology and the Draft Controversy. But I think that it is also fair to say, I think you would agree, Rabbi Pfeffer, that this goes a lot further than the draft controversy, that the focus of the article might be, or the relevance of the article might be, about the Haredi draft controversy, but it actually goes a lot further and is far more influential in a lot of different aspects of Israeli life and Israeli society. So I just want to begin with a few statistics. As of 2023, the Haredi population makes up 13.6% of Israeli society, but their influence is rather greater than that. The Haredi parties make up 15% of the Knesset, but in the ruling coalition in the government, the Haredi parties make up about 28%, which is more than twice their population numbers of the ruling coalition. And if I remember correctly, I think I saw a statistic at some point that said that they also make up 25% or so of Hebrew language education instruction in Israel. So it's very sizable. And obviously, there's a lot of news events going on today, the war in Lebanon that we're all watching very closely. But just yesterday and today, there was another news story in Israel about a Haredi protest in Beit Shemesh. So I think that offers us perhaps a rather timely opportunity to discuss this phenomenon. So I wonder whether you could first just tell us a little bit about what happened yesterday, your thoughts on what happened yesterday, and we can move into the discussion.
Well, excuse me. Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me here. It was a privilege and a pleasure to write this piece. And really, it was an opportunity to take a step back. I think you're right. The nature of the piece transcended the specific issue of the draft. And that's its charm, meaning, we often dig down into the details, into specific issues, whether it's economics, whether it's the workforce, whether it's education, and of course the draft. But it's just helpful to be able to take a step back and a kind of more sweeping view, and being asked to write about faith, as this issue of SAPIR is about, was very refreshing and I think helpful. And what we had today or yesterday in the news cycle is just a demonstration of how Haredim are very much a part of the everyday news cycle in Israel. This specific issue was a demonstration of more extremist Haredim, the type that you have in certain areas of Beit Shemesh. They hail originally from Jerusalem. These are the kind of, you would call them the old Yishuv of Yerushalayim, and they were protesting against some of the more recent phenomena within Haredi society that they believe to be dangerous, caustic, undermining the foundations of Haredi society. This particular conference was related to entry into the workforce on a higher level. It can be for women, it could be for men, it could be so many things. But it's just a sign of the tensions internally within Haredi society that are related to the type of changes that are taking place in within the Haredi world.
See, pardon me, I'm a little bit. I have bubonic plague, I think. Oh. Give me a moment. It's very, very interesting. I think I hope we can get into some of the internal divisions a little bit later on in the discussion. But to take a step back, I imagine that there are certainly a number of people tuning in today who are very familiar with the Haredi community, how it operates, what it's like, maybe some people who have lived in the Haredi community. But I imagine we also have many people who are joining us who are not so familiar with it, haven't really had much interaction with it. So I wonder whether you could give us a little bit of a primer on Haredi community, maybe your own background as well, and bring people a little bit up to speed to the population that we're discussing.
Yeah, so that's obviously a bit of a, the scope is very broad. I give an entire semesterial course at Hebrew University on this topic of what is Haredi society. So, but if you want it from a personal perspective, I grew up in England. This is outside of the Israeli Haredi space. But upon coming to Israel to study in the yeshiva system, I very much fell in love with the Haredi way of life, with Haredi living. This was a world that certainly as a young adult was extremely attractive in its potential for a total immersion in a life of Torah, a life that revolves around both Torah study and the realization of that study in everyday life, and the strategy to enable that kind of total immersion, that totality of a Torah society is a strategy of, you would call it withdrawal, isolationism from a lot of the aspects of the modern world that present challenges or even threats to that way of life. And as I mentioned, I very much fell in love with that Haredi way of life. This is where I, continue to live my life, and many of my activities are within the Haredi space. And certainly I'm the first to appreciate all that's good and pure in the Haredi space, which is a lot. At the same time, once you become so large a part of Israeli society, and you said some of the statistics already, but there are many more that can be said about poverty levels, about the economics of it, and not to speak about the hot issue today, the army issue, then the question becomes, well, how big can you be and still maintain this withdrawal, which ultimately means a division of responsibilities? We, the Haredim, are responsible for Torah, for religion, for Hasidic courts, for devotion, for prayer, for religious services, and they, the rest of Israel, are responsible for everything worldly. The state, with its institutions, with its branches of government, with its army, and so on and so forth. And that becomes kind of untenable for a number of reasons. And then the question is, how do we envisage, how do we imagine a society that retains a lot of the beauty and goodness and the wholesomeness of this community life within the Haredi space, while at the same time stepping up to the responsibilities that life in Israel demands of us when we're such a large part of Israeli society? And after a few years of rabbinic studies and becoming a rabbinical judge and so on, I started to really think about these questions. I was also disturbed by the friction, sometimes even animosity between the Haredim and the rest. This was not what I expected coming from England. And this led me to a track of deep involvement in different areas of the theme, the interaction between Haredi society and the rest of Israel. That's very much a deep part of what I do and what I think about today.
So what would you say is the difference between the say the Orthodox community that you came from in England and the Haredi community in Israel? You mentioned that this was something that you didn't expect, but you fell in love with Haredi life in Israel. Was there something distinctive or unique about itself in contradistinction with Orthodox life outside of Israel and Orthodox interaction with surrounding societies in non-Jewish countries?
I mean, yes, very, very much distinctive. You know, the Chazon Ish, who was one of the great leaders in the early days of Haredi society in the state of Israel, one of the quotes that he's most famous for is his disdain for mediocrity. He was really like horrified to the core by the concept of a mediocre Judaism. And he said, we have to be all in. We have to be extreme, not extreme in the sense of demonstrations and radicalism, but extreme Jewish, extreme Torah, all the way. And Haredi society in Israel, certainly, and to a degree outside of Israel also, obviously there are significant differences. But Haredi society in Israel certainly represents that mindset, that model of extreme Torah, extreme Judaism, extreme living with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, living with God, and it's manifest in many different expressions of everyday life. That's true for the type of community and its withdrawal from the rest of Israel in terms of its interaction with everything on the outside. The ideal is to keep things internal. It's manifest in the model of Torah study, which becomes a model that excludes everything else. Torah study doesn't have to exclude everything else, but in the Haredi model, it does, or in the ideal, it does. It's manifest in the attitude towards the state of Israel, because once you become involved with the state of Israel, once you become a part of Israel's mechanism, that draws you in to a very worldly environment, to the concept of a state, to the concept of, well, you're a part of this national movement. It just takes you out of that total focus on Torah and a religious devotion. And that's very different from the kind of motion, the internal motion of the community in which I grew up.
I see. And you mentioned in the article, I guess we could maybe go through some of the argument, but you talk about that there is something genuinely revolutionary, not only in how the community operates, but in its theology and how they think about Torah and how they think about God. And it's very it's revolutionary and like you say, has major consequences both for its own community and for Israeli society as a whole. Can you take us through what your argument there is about the revolutionary nature of its theology and how it operates internally?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll preface and say that we don't wake up every morning and think about theology. Okay, this is not something, you'll ask a guy on the street, what's the Haredi theology? He's not going to come up with this answer or with any other answer. It's important to point this out. Haredi life is a lived ideology. This reminds me a little bit of the famous Soloveitchik article, Rupture and Reconstruction. It's a mimetic tradition. You hand it down. This is what we do. This is how we live. However, there's no such thing as this is how we live without underlying ideas that are there. They're there in the world. They're there in the air that we breathe. They're there in the yeshiva space, in the way in which the mashgiach, the deans and the heads of the yeshiva will speak. And the point that I tried to bring out in this article was the question of the balance between human works, human initiative and endeavor, industry. You know, America prides itself on this, on being industrious, on being, hardworking, on the one hand, and between the bitachon, the trust in God, and giving everything unto God on the other. And there's always a balance between those two. Every religious person experiences something of that tension. On the one hand, well, everything is from God. We're about to go into Rosh Hashanah, and the Gemara tells us that a person's sustenance, his income is decided on Rosh Hashanah. So everything is divinely ordained. Everything is from God. But on the other hand, I mean, we live in the world, and living in the world tells us that we need to actually operate and function and invest within the world in order to make sure that we have money, that we have an income, that we're healthy, that we have a home in which to live, that we take care of our kids. We have to invest in the worldly sense. And there's a balance between those two, which is always in flux, and it's always there. And we think about this a lot if we're religious people. And in the Haredi space, the balance between that in the lectures, in the books, in the rhetoric, was taken to an extreme end within that spectrum, to say that whatever we do in the worldly sense is not going to make a difference. Everything is divinely ordained to the degree that any kind of human investment is immaterial to the outcome. It's not going to make any difference. And it's not that these ideas have never been written before, Haredi society came along and promoted them, but they've never been implemented. They've never dominated a culture so strongly as in the Haredi space today. And I think that goes together with the strategy of isolationism as a way of preserving the good life, the wholesome life that Haredi society wants to preserve, this Torah life. Well, if you want to isolate from the world, then the world itself needs to be somewhat devalued, for want of a better term. The investment in the world, you'll find, I mentioned this in the article, should we, as a society, as a country, let's say we have a Haredi state, will that Haredi state be invested in cancer research? And it's amazing to find, different Haredi thinkers, and these are the deeper thinkers within Haredi society, saying, no, we would not, because it's pointless. Cancer research is not going to save anyone because everything is divinely ordained. And that's a kind of attitude that, even though it's not well articulated on the Haredi street, but it's an attitude that deeply permeates a lot of the different ways in which we, within the Haredi space, actually live our lives. Not everything. When kids are sick, we'll go to doctors. But there are many things on a societal level in a public space that receive justification, that receive a certain approval or justification based on that attitude.
I see. And would you say, though, that if you were to ask, I recognize, obviously, that people aren't thinking about this all the time. Everybody's just living their life, right? You're doing your work, you're raising your children, and you're not thinking about this on a daily or minute-by-minute basis. But if you were to ask someone who, say, holds this view or who thinks in this way, about, say, the war that's going on right now, both in Gaza and in northern Israel, who is protecting the country? Would they say it is the army? Would they say that it is God? Would they say it's a combination of both? And would they say that they are playing some role in that?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I was giving a share. I was giving a class on an army base. Okay, I was at an army base in the south of Israel, Ir Abadim, which is this large city of training camps, and there was a Haredi group. This is from the Shlav Bet, stage 2, like all the Haredi individuals who had volunteered really to participate in the army, to do this basic training course, and then afterwards they'll be eligible for doing miluim, for doing reserve service. And I spoke a little bit about the army and about how it's a privilege to be a part of the army and to defend the Jewish people. And at the end, I was taken aback. One of the participants actually got up. He didn't say this publicly, but he came. I correct myself. He raised his hand. We didn't have time to take the question, but he came to me at the end and made the point because it was that important to him. And he said, come on. Like, we all know that it's our Torah study that really protects the Jewish people. So it's all very nice that we're here. We're doing this because he was concerned about the Chilul Hashem. He thought it's a desecration of Hashem's name that we, the Haredim, are not taking part. So, good for him that he actually went and volunteered for army service. But he said, in the depth of our heart, we all know that the true protection comes from Torah study. And that's a deeply ingrained idea. Now, of course, you hear about this amazing, ploy of making these beepers explode, and you're impressed by the ingenuity of whoever it was that came up with the idea and the precision with which it was actually realized and implemented. But, if it wouldn't have been that way, it would have been some other way. God has a lot of ways of handling these things. And therefore it's up to us to engage in our religious devotion. And you know what? One day my kid came from school. I'll be honest and say I was shocked by this. My kid came back from school and he said, you know what? We don't need an army. If all of our soldiers would go to yeshiva, then we wouldn't need an army because we would have the divine protection. And, it's hard to react to such an approach because it's so radical. Obviously, I told my kid, well, let's open the Tanakh and see what they did back then. But that's in my private educational space. But you see, in the public space, these ideas do make a difference. They permeate. In the schools, it's each teacher for himself. There's no like clear curriculum on this. But yes, the attitudes are deeply informed by this, overall internal motion that human endeavor really doesn't make a difference, and it's all down to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
I should just translate what HaKadosh Baruch Hu means. HaKadosh Baruch Hu means the Holy One, blessed be He.
Well, it's God.
A term that we use for God in Jewish tradition. I just want to make sure that everybody understands all the terminology here. I think it's so fascinating because what you're describing is a kind of almost magical thinking, right? That there's something magical in the protection of the country. God is protecting us, and the whole apparatus of the army is in a certain sense a fiction, right? That what really is happening cosmically underneath is a divine kind of protection. And what you describe in the article is that it kind of absolves people from really playing a role in a sense. But what's fascinating about the community is that it only operates in this way, or primarily, tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to only operate in this way when it comes to matters of national involvement, of civic involvement, or military involvement, whereas people will not rely on this kind of thinking when it comes to treating an illness or making money to support their family or things like this. They will employ more of a logical and kind of materialistic rationality in their daily lives. But when it comes to the state and when it comes to their interaction with people outside of the Haredi community, that's when this thought process kicks in.
Right. So a few points on that. I think that's a very well articulated question. And let me mention a few thoughts. First of all, you mentioned magical. In a certain sense, there is a certain magic to the universe. There's a certain magic to history. And it's difficult to deny the fact that the Jewish people is still around today, after goodness knows, thousands of years of exile, 2,000 years plus of exile, depends when you start counting from, and going through all of the persecutions and hardships that we've been through. And yet here we are back in our national homeland. That's really magical. And I think it's good to appreciate the magic of that, the something beyond that transcends the natural order. The trouble is when you take that too far. And when you said the word it's a fiction, that reminded me of some Hasidic oriented Sfarim. And I will say, I didn't put this into the article, but the origins of some of these kinds of statements are more within the Hasidic world. I don't think it's by chance that one of the great proponents of this specific attitude, and I cite him in the article, is Rav Dessler, Eliezer Eliyahu Dessler, who was one of the great articulators or formulators of what we believe in the Haredi space, one of the only people that actually wrote this in his 5 volumes of Michtav Mei Eliyahu. And he was very much a person of combinations. He merged Hasidism together with his Litvish upbringing. And
I just before we continue, I just want to make sure, I wonder whether we can define any of these terms for people who might not be familiar with the distinction.
Well, yeah. So let me again. I can't get into this on any level of depth. But in the Hasidic space, there was this attempt to popularize the more Kabbalistic, more you could say like magical or Kabbalistic elements of Jewish thought and bring them into everyday life and everyday consciousness. And part of that, or within that, is this idea that this world is something of a fiction. Really, everything is godly. Everything is divine presence, which is infinite and everywhere. Think of the Baal HaTanya in the Chabad theology and so on. And there's this concept of bittul, that we nullify ourselves to divine providence. Those ideas are dominant, at least they're deeply present in Hasidic thought. And I think that a lot of this attitude, bringing it to life, bringing it to everyday consciousness, kind of comes from that part of the Jewish world of Torah thought. But to your question of, more specifically, is it in a public sense vis-a-vis Israel? What about in the private sense? It's not entirely accurate. Even in the private sense, when we think about all the men who are not going to work, again, some, the cynics among us will say, well, they're relying on their wives going to work and they, and getting an apartment from their fathers-in-law and renting it out. But the truth of the matter is that not going to work, not getting an education, not having the toolkit for having a job is deeply impactful on your personal life. That's not, vis-a-vis the state of Israel. The state of Israel might give you, some kind of a welfare state income, but you're going to be poor. It's not easy to live that way. You have to marry off your kids, and marrying off your kids in my part of the Haredi space is no cheap endeavor. It's about buying apartments for them so they'll be able to sit and learn and won't have to worry about paying rent. It's not simple. And even in the private sphere, you have a lot of, well, God will take care of it. You just sit and learn, and things will somehow work themselves out. And how do you decide when do you do that? And when do you say, no, I'm going to go to the best doctor because my kid's sick? I'm not going to go to some mediocre doctor. I'm going to go to the best one. Hey, what about your trust in God? If it's all up to God, go to Stam, any doctor, go to the local nurse, go to anyone. Well, that's kind of delineated by tradition. It's what we do, meaning we've always gone to the best doctors and we've always, relied on divine providence for our parnasa. Now, when did that always start? That tradition started somewhere. So I don't know. And I could write another piece on, thinking about this historically, but that's not the point that we want to speak about now. In terms of the essay, this is how the Haredi space has developed, has molded, has become tradition over time. And today, not just today, 20, 30, 40 years ago already, people were born into a well-set mold of when do we do the word in Hebrew that we use is hishtadlut, when do we make our human effort, our investment in the fullest sense of the world, and when do we say, you know what, this is down to God, and we're not doing this. And of course, it is especially prominent in terms of the division of responsibility with the state of Israel. And that, like I said in the opening remarks, that is set to change.
I mean, it sounds like what you're calling for is I think something of a revolution in this sense, like that there should be a shift away from this, and that the Haredi community has to recalibrate in light of the facts on the ground, the size of the community, and it's becoming unsustainable. And like you say, its relationships with the state of Israel is of particular importance because of the amount of political power it has, the size of the community, and its interaction. You know, Micha Goodman has said recently that this debate about the relationship between the Haredi world and the Haredi society and the rest of Israeli society will be the defining political debate of the next stage of Israel's existence, right? He has this way of describing how it was originally the debate between socialism and free market economics, and then that was relatively resolved, I think, in favor of free market economics for the most part. Then came the debate about land for peace with Israel's Arab neighbors and the Palestinians. And he points out how this debate kind of lost a lot of its energy after the failure of Oslo, but that the next debate that will define Israeli society will be this and the role that the Haredi world plays in Israel's future. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment?
So I definitely think that this is set to become at least one, if not the issue that will define the contours of, you know, the track of Israeli society. But let me just give a little bit of insight or comment to that statement that you made. First of all, I'm not calling for revolution. I'm an evolution. It's an evolution, not revolution thing, number one. But number two, and deeper than that, the evolution is happening. That's exactly the item you started with in yesterday's news cycle, that you have these Haredi extremists demonstrating against Haredim who are not exactly towing their brand of what the party line ought to be, meaning there's a force of nature which is driving Haredim to be more involved in Israel. That force of nature has a lot of different facets and elements to it. One is, of course, economic and the sustainability question. Another is the exposure issue. It was one thing to wage a war against television. Anyone with an antenna on the roof doesn't get into shul or get into school. But today you have a router in your bedroom and a laptop, and you're connected to the world. It's a whole different, you know, reality in terms of the possibility of isolating and withdrawing. But beyond that, Israeli society is in a different place. And of course, on the one hand, that's reflected in the tension vis-a-vis the Haredim. You know, why aren't you serving? Come on, get your act together. We can't do this on our own. We need boots on the ground. We need you to be involved. That's on the one hand. But on the other, and for me, this is very dear and very deep. On the other, the question is, what is our ultimate purpose as a Haredi society? Our ultimate purpose is not to withdraw forever. That's not an ambition. That's not an aspiration. Withdrawal is a defense mechanism, but you can't always play defense, because in the end, as we learn, that's not a good strategy. Once you've been empowered to the degree that Haredi society has become empowered, and once, in any case, you're going to become integrated within Israel by hook or by crook, then let's think how we can do this in the most positive way. Let's think how we can do this in a way that will infuse Israel with greater spiritual energy, with a closeness to God, with a wholesomeness that much of Haredi society can perhaps teach the rest of Israel, if we'll only translate it into Hebrew. I don't mean just the words, but in the sense of being able to communicate to others. And I feel it's not just, you know, evolution, it's opportunity. And the time has come to rise to this responsibility, to rise to this opportunity. Israel needs it, the Haredim need it, the Jewish people need it. And I have a certain sense, this kind of intuition, if you want, that, you know, we've got to where we are for this. We didn't get to where we are in order to perpetuate isolationism. It's not about the isolation. It's about maintaining your core values and being able to spread them, to become a lighthouse rather than a Noah's Ark.
And what do you think the leaders of the community, the other leaders in the Haredi world in Israel, would say in response to what you just said, and in response to the article? What would their counterpoint be?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and we could spend a long time that we don't have. But I can tell you one thing. I engage in conversation with rabbinic leaders. I think, you know, these are elders and they have great wisdom, and I engage in conversation with them. And sometimes the impression that I get, and by the way, for example, about Iyun, the journal, I've had many conversations because it was threatened by different activists, and you know, these things got to the rabbis, and to their credit, they called me up and we had conversations. Okay. Sometimes I got the following impression. These are not issues that we want to tackle head on. It's not the way we perceive our leadership to facilitate and enable the kind of internal motion that you're speaking about. But we appreciate that there are large segments within the Haredi space that do need this, that are going to be there in any case. They're anyway in the workforce. They're anyway out there on the internet. They're anyway going to the army. If they're going to the army, they need to be able to think internally about what that means, about how to maintain your core values while you're in the army and to spread them out. We appreciate that that's a necessity. And that doesn't mean that certain rabbinic leaders won't oppose the article and its implementation, its realization. Of course they will. And because it comes from a place of true anxiety. You know, the Haredi society was built with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over multiple decades, and there's anxiety over losing that, and I can identify with that. I can appreciate it. What I try to communicate to the rabbinic leaders is that my work in this space is not a work of change and reform, but a work of preservation, because we're going into an entirely new period of time in terms of the relationship between the Haredim and the rest. And if we want to preserve that which we have, then we have to package it differently and to think about how we'll be able to get this through. And like I point out in the article, if you look at the world in a way that it's nullified, it's worthless, then you're not going to be able to impact it in a positive way that we actually can. You might be there, but you'll be there with your head down and in a defeatist and in, well, you know, what can I do? I'm here, but I wish I wasn't. And that's not going to work that way. And so, you know, there's tension here. On the one hand, there's an anxiety, there's concern. On the other hand, there's an appreciation that something needs to happen here. On the third hand, it shouldn't come from us, because if we'll make these statements, then that will be perceived as a revolution. That will undermine potentially this edifice of Haredi society. So it should come from the field rather than from the leading rabbinic figures.
Oh, when you say the field, you mean the pressure should come from the everyday Haredi community, from people, not rather than religious leaders.
Yeah, it's certainly not from the elite, not from the
Mm.
accepted rabbinic leadership. It can come from, rabbinic leaders. I'm the last to call myself a rabbinic leader, but a rabbi, someone that has a community somewhere, and he can do something, good for him. And by the way, this is a strategy that has played out in the Haredi space over several decades in different areas. I wouldn't call it laissez-faire altogether, but yes, some rabbinic leaders in the Haredi space have been more laissez-faire, let the people kind of mold where they need to be, and then we'll see. We'll have kind of oversight, but we'll allow this to kind of develop in a more organic way. And the truth is, that's how things are happening. Recently, one of the leading rabbinic leaders, Rav Moshe Hillel Hirsch, he's really he's also American, so I've had multiple conversations with him, and he said, you know what, for many years, we the Haredim have just been in learning. We haven't been at work, but now I see that there are many who are balancing work and learning. Well, how did that happen? It wasn't through his encouragement, but it happened. It's the new reality, and therefore I'm going to have to relate to that new reality, so that there is room there for this dynamic to take place.
So I'd like to move to some audience questions here. I have a somewhat provocative one here that I'll just say as
Give me your best shots.
give it your round. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. This is going to get a little personal. You don't look Haredi. Who is included in Haredi? Who is considered Haredi in Israel?
Yeah, this is the the ultimate question, and the ultimate, if you want, like, rejection of, well, you're not like a real Haredi. Well, what does that mean? Who's the real Haredi? I want to declare now before the audience of listeners, I'm the true Haredi. Like, follow me. What does it mean? I live within Haredi space. My kids go to Haredi institutions. My family is Israeli Haredi. My wife is Israeli Haredi. What makes you Haredi? The fact that you studied at Hebrew U. I studied at Hebrew U. Does that mean I'm like no longer Haredi? You become excluded from the club? It's a difficult, is being Haredi about living a sociology? Is it about being very frum? Is it about espousing the ideology? These are difficult questions. The Supreme Court had to handle the question of who's Haredi, and it didn't do so with great elegance, because it really is, there's no like simple, how does the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, how does it measure who's Haredi? It measures it two ways. Number one, self-identification, and number two, where are your kids, right? Institutional affiliation. And I guess that's what they have to do, because you have to do some measure. But what I can say is that my milieu is a Haredi milieu. My sphere of operation, my writing, not in SAPIR, but in my home publication, the leadership programs that I run are populated by Haredi boys and girls, young men, young women, yeshiva guys, girls just out of what they call seminary, high school for girls. That's my space of operation. So are those good creds? I don't know. It's true. My dress code is very risque in the Haredi. This is like a, blue suit. It's not. What can I say? It's something which it's slippery. But I would say, if my area of activity is in the Haredi space, and I'm talking with them, and I'm able to, to impact in whichever way I can for the good, I'm trying in that space, then that's like decent creds, I guess.
I'd like to move on to another question, but I do want to maybe get a little bit deeper on this. I think it's what you're pointing out is just how imprecise a lot of these definitions are, just really with any segment of society. But But I think that the deeper question here is about how the Haredi world sees itself, or how Haredim see themselves. And maybe there is a fear that if they were to evolve in this way in participation in society, as far as even joining the army, or to whatever extent, the question is whether they will lose a sense of their Haredi identity by doing so. Like, it is the fact, their isolationism is what makes them Haredi. And is there a fear within the community of losing that sense of self, both individually and the community as a whole? And is that something that the Israeli public, the non-Haredi Israeli public, uh, would do well to better understand in terms
Right.
of its integration efforts?
Right. So those are two separate questions, and I'll just treat them very briefly. I know we don't have a lot of time. To the first part of that question, well, absolutely, there is a threat. There is this kind of concern about what will happen to Haredi society when it loses parts of this isolation. But that loss of isolation will not happen because of Yehoshua Pfeffer or because of my friends. It's happening by force of nature. It's happening because it's happening. And the way I try to perceive my work is that's happening anyway. Let's ensure it happens in the best way possible. Let's give those Haredi young men and women the toolkit to be able to preserve those core values, even when the isolationism is not what it was. That's anyway going to happen. But you know what? I'm very proud and happy that my kids are in Haredi institutions where there is an isolationism that's preserved. My kids don't have smartphones. I'm able to control the kind of exposure that they have to, the culture and the books and the movies and so on. It's a privilege to be able to have that as one example. And there are many other examples about how even when you have this greater responsibility and greater engagement with Israel, that the isolationism principle will still hold true. And of course, it can only hold true if you're in a community. You can't isolate by yourself. If you're in a school with other kids, then good luck on your isolationism. It's not going to happen. So that's still there, but deeper, even in this, let's say, eroded or moderated isolationism, we have to know how to navigate that. And that's where I see my job in trying to make that turn out as best as it can, given that it's happening. And yes, it would be important for the rest of Israel to appreciate it. I have to say, I understand the rest of Israel's loss of patience with the Haredim. I understand it. I cannot come and have a grievance when when boys are heaven forbid being injured and killed, and we have hostages, and we're in a war with Lebanon in the north, and we're not done with the south, and I understand this lack of patience. It's difficult to not come to the Haredim and say, guys, like, come on, like, where are you? Get your act together. And to appreciate, the nuance over here, the depth of the mindset, the historical perspective and progression of where we are, and why it is so delicate, and why the rabbis are so anxious, and the army is this melting pot of the Jewish people, that of the new Israeli Jew that the Haredim are so afraid of, and so on and so forth. It's difficult to get that across in moments such as these, and therefore, yeah, it would be great if all this would be deeply appreciated. But I have no grievance against those who are coming with with some lack of patience. I have no grievance against that.
So we actually have a number of questions that speak to this, I think, in a kind of an extended level, which is how do the Haredi political parties and Haredi communities, I guess the different communities within the Haredi world, how do they reconcile their commitment to isolationism and withdrawal with the outsized role that they play in the government?
Yeah, so that's a this is a moral question, right? It's a question of morality. How do you justify on a moral level a deep involvement in Israel, in Israeli politics, while at the same time withdrawing from, let's just call it, civic society? And first of all, just to appreciate, that's what we do, quote unquote. That's what the rabbis say. That's what we do. Our justification is that that's what we do. But those that will be pressed. So you'll have different ways of justifying it. Some will say, well, we're making the greatest contribution of all through our Torah study and our religious devotion. The Haredim as the mezuzah of the state of Israel. You know, on the gateway to the state, you have the mezuzah, which gives us, you know, protection and connection to God, and that's what the Haredim give. So we're making our contribution in that way. There's the flip side of that would be, well, we would participate in the army, but the state makes it impossible because the state is promoting woke agendas and ideologies that are incompatible with Haredi life. And therefore, if we'll participate in the fullest sense, then we'll just lose our religion, and therefore it's not tenable, it's not practical. So these are the types of argumentations that you'll hear. Are they persuasive? It depends who you're speaking to, but internally within Haredi society, for the most part, they're good enough. And of course, there are those within Haredi society who say, yeah, you know, I agree, we need to do better in terms of civic responsibility. However, myself as an individual, like, what do you want from me? You know, this is about a community. It's about the public. You know, I can vote for someone else other than the Haredi representatives, but what's it going to help? So, you know, you have different types of responses from different people within Haredi society.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to raise two questions. One, we've gotten several questions very similar to this, pretty much the same thing, about how Haredi society envisions the state of Israel were it to be in charge. So, for instance, I mean, I guess the kind of imminent critique, I guess, against a lot of the thinking that you critique in the article is, what if Israel were a Haredi-run state? How would it operate if with this kind of ideology, and would it operate at all? And I think that you've addressed this question as being kind of having a clear answer, which is to say that this ideology would not allow a state to run, or at least not contribute to the world in any meaningful way. But I think the question is, do the Haredi leaders ask themselves that question in the sense that they in a way that would require them to recognize that the only reason that they survive the way they do is that they're not in charge?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's, first of all, it's a good question, and I have to, you know, be honest and say it's a painful question. I think this question exposes a lack of responsibility for the big picture. You know, it's like we have responsibility with blinkers on. Our responsibility is narrow to our little back garden. What about the big front garden? That's not our responsibility, and I think that is I think it's not okay. I think we have to step up to that broader responsibility. As a small minority, that's okay. You know, in the United States, whatever Haredim in the United States will do, America will either be okay or it won't be okay. But it's not going to, you know, the tipping point for America is not going to be the Haredim. That's not true in Israel. And the question of what will Israel do when the Haredim become a majority is not a question for the future. It's a question for the present. And I feel that, you know, kicking that can down the line and saying, we'll figure it out when we get there, or some say, no, we'll never get that. I heard Litzman being asked this question on interview, and his answer was, we'll never be a majority, we'll always be a minority. That's really all he can say, because the whole system is designed for a small minority. But we're not a small minority anymore. We're a part of that majority, and it's up to us to take that responsibility, at the very least, to formulate what do we want. I asked a parliamentary advisor once, what do you want? He said, well, if we'll be a majority, we'll pick up the phone to Trump. At the time, it was Trump's presidency, and we'll put in a petition to become the 51st state. That's not true. You're kidding yourself, and it's evading the basic responsibility. And I think that's a painful question.
I really very appreciate that, very much appreciate that answer, and I think a lot of people on the call do as well. We are at just past 1 o'clock. I do want to, though, give you an opportunity to just say a little bit about what you're doing and what the kinds of initiatives that exist to try to integrate Haredim into the army or into the workforce, and in national service, or maybe in paramedical fields, in ways that contribute to the society, that are less threatening to religious practice.
Right. So, ultimately, this whole project of healthy Haredi integration can only work if you have an ecosystem. Because without a full system, then you'll always be threatened as an individual, as a family, by some element which doesn't fit with everything else that you're doing. And that could be, well, if you send your son to the new type of yeshiva that also has general studies, then maybe that means your daughter won't be accepted into some other school that you want to get into. So you need boys' education, you need girls' education. But what if you end up studying in academia? How will that affect let's say the schooling of your kids? How will that affect the standing in your community? How will that affect your shidduchim prospects, right? So if you go to the army, what does that mean for all these other elements? So ultimately, it has to be kind of a holistic, like an ecosystem that includes all of these different moving parts within the Haredi space, and all of them are in motion, in flux. They all have their own dynamic, but you have to think about all of them. And there are people within the Haredi space who are engaged in each one of these different elements, whether it's community building, whether it's yeshivas, whether it's elementary schools, whether it's girls' education, whether it's workforce, whether it's academia, army, and so on. Today I chair the board of Netzach Yehuda, which is an organization that tries to think about how do we bring soldiers, Haredim, into the army and ensure that their army service is meaningful, both in a national sense, but also in a religious sense. How do we do that to preserve? And of course that's a tremendous undertaking. But my day job, if you want, is to try to provide the kind of engine of ideas, publications, and people to carry those ideas. Every movement needs to have ideas and needs to have people to carry them. It needs to have publications that provide the kind of tribal bonfire that people can kind of coalesce around. And that's what I try to do. And Sarach Iyun is a journal of ideas. Hamakom is a popular magazine. I run leadership programs where we bring in young Haredi men and women, and we think about what's our responsibility and how do we discharge it, and we study different parts of public policy and think about it from a Jewish and Haredi perspective. And I'm just one piece of this puzzle. I try to imagine it as an important piece, but I do realize it's just one piece, and you need all of these pieces of this big puzzle. And like you said, it's not about the future of the Haredim, it's about the future of Israel in the deeper sense. And it's not about party politics, it's about politics in terms of society. And I will mention, it takes two to tango. It needs Israeli society to be ready for the entry of Haredim, which is not simple. It's true that in the past, the army has not wanted Haredim so much because it's a headache. it's just a headache. And think about it, the army is promoting, feminist agendas, and all of a sudden you have these Haredim. How do you square that? It's a headache. It's not simple. And to invite Haredim has to be a sincere invitation, that you're invited to really participate and to take part in the conversation. Is, Israeli society sincere in that invitation? It takes two to tango, and that's not my job. That other people will have to do that particular part of the bigger puzzle. My job is, thank God, cut out in what I'm trying to do in my own space.
Well, I think we're all very grateful that you are in that space and for all the work that you're doing. So I want to thank you very much for joining us today and for writing the article, for sharing these very important insights with us. I'm sure we could be speaking for the rest of the day about this if we had the time. But but I do invite everybody to read the article if you have not yet, and of course to share it widely.
Yeah, no, thank you, Phil. For those who are interested in reading more, a lot of the Tzarachian articles are rendered into English, so there's a whole wealth of material there. And if you're into Hebrew reading, then you have the jackpot. So, but thank you, Phil, for the opportunity. And I also really appreciated the issue, the journal, generally the issue, and the opportunity to make the contribution.
All right, thank you so much. And so long, everyone, and chazak v'matz.
Shana Tova.
Shana tova.